Most men build empires to create wealth. Enzo Ferrari built an empire to burn it. By 1963, the red paint on the cars at Maranello was the only thing that wasn't in the red. Enzo was 70 years old. He lived in a house with the shutters closed. Mourning a son, he lost a muscular dystrophy and a world that was moving too fast for his hand-built traditions. He was a man of the 19th century, trapped in the 20th. He didn't care about market share or consumer satisfaction. He viewed his customers, the movie stars and playboys who bought his road cars, as a necessary plague. They were merely the ATM that funded his true obsession, Scuderia Ferrari, his racing team. But the gilded truth was that the ATM was empty. Ferrari was producing fewer than 700 cars a year. He was bankrupt in every way but spirit. 4,000 miles away, Henry Ford II, known in the boardrooms as the Deuce, was suffocating under the weight of his grandfather's legacy. Ford was the blue-collar king, a behemoth of mass production. They made millions of cars, but they lacked one thing: soul. Ford's marketing team told him the baby boomers didn't want the cars their fathers drove. They wanted sex appeal. They wanted speed. They wanted Ferrari. In May of 1963, a 22-page contract was flown to Italy. Ford wasn't just offering a partnership, he was offering a rescue. $10 million of fortune in 1963 to buy the Ferrari name. For 20 days, the negotiations were polite. The lawyers discussed pensions, factory footprints, and logistics. But on the morning of May 21st, Enzo reached page 22, paragraph 4, subsection H. It was a clause stating that Ford would control the budget for the racing team. Enzo didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He stood up, looked at the Ford executives, and unleashed a torrent of Italian vitriol that the translators were too terrified to repeat. He insulted the Ford name. He insulted the Ford cars. He called Henry Ford II not a titan, but a clerk. He walked out, leaving the Americans sitting in the dust of a broken deal. He had used Ford's offer to bait a better deal from Fiat, a fellow Italian company. He had played the Americans like a cheap violin. When the word reached Dearborn, it wasn't just a failed business acquisition. It was a blood insult. Henry Ford II didn't just want to compete anymore. He wanted to erase Enzo Ferrari from the history books. Ford's orders were absolute. Find me a car that can beat him. If we don't have one, build one. I don't care if it costs $10 million or $100 million. I want the prancing horse turned into a glue factory. The gilded truth was that the $50 billion war for speed was never about technology. It was about two men, two egos, and a purple pen that changed the course of the 20th century. Ford's first attempt to kill the horse was a disaster of corporate vanity. They tried to do it the Ford way: committees, spreadsheets, and men in white lab coats who had never smelled burnt rubber. They bought a chassis from a small British firm called Lola, threw a V8 engine in it, and called it the GT40. In its first outing at Le Mans in 1964, the Ford fleet didn't just lose, they evaporated. One car burst into flames, another's gearbox shattered, the third simply couldn't handle the physics of the Mossen Strait. Ford had spent millions to prove one thing: you cannot buy a soul with a corporate budget. Henry Ford II realized he couldn't win this war from a boardroom in Dearborn. He needed a fixer. He needed Carroll Shelby. Shelby was a man of contradictions, a chicken farmer turned Le Mans winner whose heart was failing him. He was a gilded archetype, a man who lived on nitroglycerin pills and pure adrenaline. But Shelby knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed a ghost, a man the corporate world had rejected. He needed Ken Miles. Ken Miles was a British World War II tank commander who lived in a garage in Hollywood. He was a mechanical savant with a suicide temperament. He didn't care about Ford's stock price. He cared about the truth of the machine. To the suits at Ford, Miles was unmarketable. To Shelby, he was the only man alive who could talk to a car at 100 miles per hour. Shelby and Miles didn't improve the GT40. They lobotomized it. They threw away the sophisticated European components and replaced them with a massive 427 cubic inch V8, an engine designed for NASCAR. It was brute force incarnate, but the gilded truth of the GT40 was its aerodynamics. The car was so fast it was trying to take flight. Miles spent weeks on the Riverside track, taping bits of yarn to the car's body to see how the wind moved. No computers, no wind tunnels, just yarn, wind, and a man willing to die to find a 5-mile-per-hour advantage. Enzo Ferrari wasn't blind. He heard the thunder coming from America. He knew Shelby. He knew the 427 engine. But Enzo believed in the divine right of the aristocrat. He believed that American iron could never defeat Italian art. He pushed his engineers to the breaking point. He demanded more RPMs, more lightness, more beauty. He was building the Ferrari 330 B3. It was a hand-sculpted masterpiece of magnesium and aluminum. The stage was set. In Dearborn, a king was spending his fortune. In Maranello, a god was spending his soul. And in a garage in California, two outlaws were preparing to set the world on fire. The 1966 Le Mans wasn't just a race anymore. It was a collision of two eras. And the gilded truth is that when two titans clash, the first thing to break isn't the metal, it's the men. June 18th, 1966, 4 o'clock p.m. The air in Le Mans, France, is thick with more than just humidity. It is thick with the scent of race fuel, French cigarettes, and the unspoken fear of 45 men who know they might not see the sunrise. This was the era before safety culture. There were no carbon fiber tubs, no computer-simulated crash zones. You were sitting on top of 100 gallons of high-octane gasoline, separated from the trees by a skin of aluminum thinner than a soda can. At the Mulsanne Strait, these cars would hit 210 miles per hour. At that speed, the human eye can barely process the horizon. The first 4 hours were a massacre. Ford's strategy was the blitzkrieg. Henry Ford, too, had ordered his drivers to run at a suicidal pace to bait the Ferraris into a speed trap. If Ferrari tried to keep up, their delicate, hand-tuned engines would explode. If they didn't, Ford would disappear into the distance. But the gilded truth was that Ford's own cars were melting. The GT40 was so heavy and so fast that the brakes were literally liquefying. This is where the $50 billion investment met the fixer. While Ferrari crews were meticulously cleaning parts with silk rags, Ford's team did something unheard of. They replaced the entire brake assembly rotors, calipers, and pads during a routine pit stop. It was industrial warfare applied to a sport of finesse. Enzo Ferrari watched from the pits, his dark glasses hiding eyes that finally understood. He wasn't fighting a racing team. He was fighting a factory. Midnight. The rain began to fall. This is where the ghost, Ken Miles, separated himself from the mortals. While other drivers slowed down to navigate the blindness of the spray, Miles accelerated. He was listening to the car. He knew the vibration of the 427 V8 better than he knew his own heartbeat. One by one, the Ferraris began to fail. The P3, the beautiful, hand-built masterpieces, began to overheat. Their gearboxes, designed for elegance, shattered under the relentless American torque. By 3 o'clock a.m., the Maranello Dream was a pile of steaming scrap metal in the French mud. The war was won, the prancing horse had been broken. Henry Ford too stood on the balcony, a king surveying his new territory. But the gilded truth of victory is that it always demands a sacrifice. Ford didn't just want to win, they wanted a photo. They ordered Ken Miles, who was laps ahead of everyone else, to slow down. They wanted all three Fords to cross the finish line at the same time for the ultimate corporate advertisement. Miles had a choice: defy the empire and take the trophy he had bled for, or obey the clocks and give them their photo. He slowed down. He gave Ford their gilded moment. But in the fine print of the rules, because the second Ford car had started further back on the grid, it was technically ruled the winner by distance. Ken Miles, the man who built the car, tested the car, and dominated the race, was robbed of his glory by a mathematical technicality and a PR stunt. The photo was perfect, 3 Fords, crossing the line in a display of industrial dominance that the world would never forget. But on the podium, the gilded truth was written in the silence. Because of a technicality, the fact that Bruce McLaren's Ford had started 20 yards further back on the grid, he was declared the winner. Ken Miles, the man who had breathed life into the GT40, the man who had outdriven the entire Ferrari factory in the rain, was relegated to second place. He had been robbed by the very corporate clerks Enzo Ferrari had warned him about. Ford had their marketing image. They had their victory. But they had sacrificed their best soldier to get it. Most men would have quit. But Ken Miles wasn't most men. 2 months after Le Mans, he was back in the cockpit. Ford wasn't satisfied with one win. They wanted a car that was even lighter, even faster. They called it J-Car, August 17, 1966. 102 degrees in the California desert. Miles was pushing the J-Car to its absolute limit, hitting 200 miles per hour on the back straight. He was searching for the truth of the new design. but the design had a flaw that no amount of Shelby magic could fix. The car flipped. It disintegrated into a ball of fire. Ken Miles, the ghost of Ellie Mans, was killed instantly. He died at the age of 47, leaving behind a legacy that Ford would spend the next 50 years trying to polish. When the news reached Italy, Enzo didn't celebrate. He knew that with Miles gone, the soul of the Ford program was wounded. But Enzo himself was facing a new kind of death. He was still broke. The $10 million Ford had offered was gone, and the victory at Ellie Mans had given Ford the glow that used to belong solely to Ferrari. Enzo realized he couldn't fight the future alone. In 1969, he finally did what he vowed he would never do. He sold. Not to Ford, but to Fiat. He sold his road car division for the sake of his racing soul. He remained a dictator of the racing team. But the gilded truth was that he was now an employee in his own kingdom. The war was over, but the war for speed had created a new economy. The brand equity generated by those 4 years of hatred, 1963 to 1967, is what sustains the Ferrari and Ford names today. When you see a Ferrari today, you aren't seeing a car. You are seeing the ego of a man who refused to be bought. When you see a Ford performance vehicle, you are seeing the might of a man who refused to be insulted. But as we move into the final act, we must ask, was it worth it? The money, the steel, and the lives? Or was the gilded truth simply that two rich men used the world as a playground for their own insecurities? By 1970, the fire had burned out. Henry Ford too had his victory. He had humiliated Enzo Ferrari 4 times in a row. But the world was changing. The oil crisis was looming. Emission regulations were being drafted in smoke-filled rooms. The era of the unlimited budget was over. Ford shuttered the racing program. They took the lessons learned at Ellie Mans and applied them to family sedans and pickup trucks. The GT40, the car that beat the world, was mothballed. It went from a weapon of war to a marketing ghost. Ford returned to what it was, a factory of the masses. But they had learned one gilded truth: prestige is a currency that never devalues. For Enzo, the defeat at Ellie Mans was a blessing in disguise. It forced him to professionalize, with Fiat's money backing him. He turned Ferrari from a struggling workshop into an untouchable luxury brand. He realized that the more exclusive the car, the more people would beg to buy it. In 1987, at the age of 89, he oversaw his final masterpiece, the F40. It was a car with no carpets, no radio, and no door handles, just raw, terrifying speed. It was his final middle finger to the corporate world. When he died a year later, the waitlist for a Ferrari didn't just grow. It became a global obsession. He didn't die a bankrupt mechanic. He died a deity of the Gilded Age. Today, Ferrari is worth over $50 billion. That is more than Ford, General Motors, or Stellantis. Think about the gilded truth in that number. A company that produces a few thousand cars a year is worth more than companies that produce millions. The war between Henry and Enzo created the luxury performance segment. It taught the world that a car isn't just transportation, it's an asset. It's a status symbol. It's an ego on wheels. Every time a collector pays $20 million for a vintage Ferrari at auction, they are paying for the ghost of that 1963 insult. They are paying for the purple ink on a rejected contract. We look back at the 1966 Ellie Mans as a triumph of engineering. But the gilded truth is that it was a tragedy of the human ego. Henry Ford too spent a fortune to prove he was a man of taste. Enzo Ferrari spent his soul to prove he was a man of art. And Ken Miles gave his life to prove that at 200 miles per hour, the only thing that matters is the truth of the machine. The cars have changed, the men are gone. But the war for speed continues in every boardroom and every supercar showroom on the planet. Because as long as there is ego, there will be a race. And as long as there is a race, there will be a truth worth gilding.